Much to my surprise, the fingernails had been trimmed. I complimented her, and praised her for making such a sacrifice. I also thanked her mother for influencing Babette to cut her nails. Her reply was, "Oh, I had nothing to do with it. Babette decided to do it on her own, and this is the first time she has ever trimmed her nails for anyone." Quote, did Mrs. Norris threaten Babette? Did she say she would refuse to teach a student with long fingernails? No, she did not. She let Babette know that her fingernails were a thing of beauty, and it would be a sacrifice to cut them. She implied, "Sympathize with you, I know it won't be easy, but it will pay off in your better musical development." Soul Hero Rock was probably America's #1 impresario. For almost half a century he handled artists, such world-famous artists as Jay Liopin, Sadara Duncan, and Pavlova. Mr. Hero Rock told me that one of the first lessons he had learned, in dealing with his temperamental stars, was the necessity for sympathy and more sympathy with their idiosyncrasies. For 3 years, he was impresario for Fyodor Chaliapin, one of the greatest bassos who ever thrilled the ritzy box holders at the Metropolitan, yet Chaliapin was a constant problem. He carried on like a spoiled child. To put it in Mr. Hero Rock's own inimitable phrase, he was a hell of a fellow in every way. For example, Chaliapin would call up Mr. Hero Rock about noon of the day he was going to sing and say, "Soul, I feel terrible. My throat is like raw hamburger. It is impossible for me to sing tonight." Did Mr. Hero Rock argue with him? Oh, no. He knew that an entrepreneur couldn't handle artists that way. So he would rush over to Chaliapin's hotel, dripping with sympathy. "What a pity," quote, he would mourn. "What a pity. My poor fellow. Of course, you cannot sing. I will cancel the engagement at once. It will only cost you a couple of $1,000, but that is nothing in comparison to your reputation." Then Chaliapin would sigh and say, "Perhaps you had better come over later in the day. Come at 5, and see how I feel then." At 5 o'clock, Mr. Hero Rock would again rush to his hotel, dripping with sympathy. Again he would insist on cancelling the engagement, and again Chaliapin would sigh and say, "Well, maybe you had better come to see me later. I may be better then." At 7:30 the great basso would consent to sing, only with the understanding that Mr. Hero Rock would walk out on the stage of the Metropolitan, and announce that Chaliapin had a very bad cold, and was not in good voice. Mr. Hero Rock would lie and say he would do it, for he knew that was the only way to get the basso out on the stage. Dr. Arthur I. Gates said in his splendid book Educational Psychology, "Sympathy the human species universally craves. The child eagerly displays his injury, or even inflicts a cut or bruise, in order to reap abundant sympathy. For the same purpose adults show their bruises, relate their accidents, illness, especially details of surgical operations. Self-pity for misfortunes real or imaginary is in some measure, practically a universal practice. So, if you want to win people to your way of thinking, put in practice. Principle 9. Be sympathetic with the other person's ideas and desires. 10. An appeal that everybody likes. I was reared on the edge of the Jesse James country out in Missouri, and I visited the James farm at Kearney, Missouri, where the son of Jesse James was then living. His wife told me stories of how Jesse robbed trains and held up banks, and then gave money to the neighboring farmers to pay off their mortgages. Jesse James probably regarded himself as an idealist at heart, just as Dutch Schultz, Two Gun Crowley, Al Capone and many other organized crime godfathers did generations later. The fact is that all people you meet have a high regard for themselves, and like to be fine and unselfish in their own estimation. J. Pierpont Morgan observed, in one of his analytical interludes, that a person usually has 2 reasons for doing a thing. One that sounds good and real. 1. The person himself will think of the real reason. You don't need to emphasize that. But all of us, being idealists at heart, like to think of motives that sound good. So, in order to change people, appeal to the noble motives. Is that too idealistic to work in business? Let us see. Let us take the case of Hamilton J. Farrell of the Farrell Mitchell Company of Glen Oldham, Pennsylvania. Mr. Farrell had a disgruntled tenant who threatened to move. The tenant's lease still had 4 months to run. Nevertheless, he served notice that he was vacating immediately, regardless of lease. "These people had lived in my house all winter, the most expensive part of the year," Mr. Farrell said as he told the story to the class, "and I knew it would be difficult to rent the apartment again before fall. I could see all that rent income going over the hill, and believe me, saw red. Now, ordinarily, I would have waded into that tenant, and advised him to read his lease again. I would have pointed out that if he moved, the full balance of his rent would fall due at once, and that I could, and would, move to collect. However, instead of flying off the handle and making a scene, I decided to try other tactics. So I started like this. Mr. Dill said, I have listened to your story, and I still don't believe you intend to move. Years in the renting business have taught me something about human nature, and I sized you up in the first place as being a man of your word. In fact, I am so sure of it, that I am willing to take a gamble. Quote now, here rests my proposition. Leave your decision on the table for a few days, and think it over. If you come back to me between now and the 1st of the month, when your rent is due, and tell me you still intend to move, I give you my word I will accept your decision as final. I will privilege you to move and admit to myself I've been wrong in my judgment. But I still believe you're a man of your word, and will live up to your contract. For after all, we are either men or monkeys, and the choice usually lies with ourselves. Well, when the new month came around, this gentleman came to see me, and paid his rent in person. He and his wife had talked it over, he said, and decided to stay. They had concluded that the only honourable thing to do was to live up to their lease. When the late Lord Northcliffe found a newspaper using a picture of him which he didn't want published, he wrote the editor a letter. But did he say, please do not publish that picture of me anymore, I don't like it? No, he appealed to a noble motive. He appealed to the respect and love that all of us have for motherhood. He wrote, please do not publish that picture of me anymore, my mother doesn't like it. When John D. Rockefeller Jr. wished to stop newspaper photographers from snapping pictures of his children, he too appealed to the noble motives. He didn't say, I don't want their pictures published. No, he appealed to the desire, deep in all of us, to refrain from harming children. He said, you know how it is, boys. You've got children yourselves, some of you, and you know it's not good for youngsters to get too much publicity. When Cyrus H.K. Curtis, the poor boy from Maine, was starting on its meteoric career, which was destined to make him millions as owner of the Saturday Evening Post and the Ladies' Home Journal, he couldn't afford to pay his contributors the prices that other magazines paid. He couldn't afford to hire first-class authors to write for money alone. So he appealed to their noble motives. For example, he persuaded even Louisa May Alcott, the immortal author of Little Women, to write for him, when she was at the flood tide of her fame, and he did it by offering to send her a check for $100, not to her, but to her favorite charity. Right here the skeptic may say, oh, that stuff is alright for Northcliffe and Rockefeller or a sentimental novelist. But I'd like to see you make it work with the tough babies I have to collect bills from. You may be right. Nothing will work in all cases, and nothing will work with all people. If you are satisfied with the results you are now getting, why change? If you are not satisfied, why not experiment? At any rate, I think you will enjoy reading this true story told by James L. Thomas, a former student of mine. 6 customers of a certain automobile company refused to pay their bills for servicing. None of the customers protested the entire bill, but each claimed that one charge was wrong. In each case, the customer had signed for the work done, so the company knew it was right, and said so. That was the first mistake. Here are the steps the men in the credit department took to collect these overdue bills. Do you suppose they succeeded? 1. They called on each customer, and told him bluntly that they had come to collect a bill that was long past due. 2. They made it very plain that the company was absolutely and unconditionally right, therefore he, the customer, was absolutely and unconditionally wrong. 3. They intimated that they, the company, knew more about automobiles than he could ever hope to know. So what was the argument about? 4. Result. They argued. Did any of these methods reconcile the customer and settle the account? You can answer that one yourself. At this stage of affairs, the credit manager was about to open fire with a battery of legal talent, when fortunately the matter came to the attention of the general manager. The manager investigated these defaulting clients and discovered that they all had the reputation of paying their bills promptly. Something was wrong here. Something was drastically wrong about the method of collection. So he called in James L. Thomas, and told him to collect these uncollectible accounts. Here, in his words, are the steps Mr. Thmars took. 1. My visit to each customer was likewise to collect a bill long past due. A bill that we knew was absolutely right,